The Ohio State University.
Well, it's just my absolute delight to have you back at Ohio State, and particularly in front of a crowd like this on a Friday afternoon. I think that really demonstrates the interest, the reflection of the country, really, about this national case. When I think about George Zimmerman and the death of Trayvon Martin, it's hard for me not to situate it in a sort of a long line, actually, a disturbing line of young black male deaths. And so I think that's where I want to start. I want to start with the macro. How do we situate this? When we know that Trayvon Martin was 17 years old when he was killed, just a little over a week ago, Jonathan Ferrell in North Carolina, age 24, was killed by a police officer from whom we now know he was seeking help from. And Amadou Diallo in New York City, some years ago now, shot by a number of police officers at age 23. He loses his life. And each one of these circumstances, there was something that was incorrect about the people who pulled those triggers in their thinking about the black men that they were encountering. Every one of them made a mistake. And so is it important for us, do you think, to think of these events as connected?
Absolutely. I think we have to think of them as state-sanctioned executions. Because to me, they follow the traditional pattern of lynching. And why do you lynch an individual? You lynch an individual so that they can stand as an example to other individuals as to this is what will happen to you if you are out of line, out of your place. And clearly, black males are receiving the message that if you're out of your line, out of your place, bad things will happen to you. And you heard me, those of you who came to my talk on Tuesday, talk about a little boyfriend I have who's 7, a little black boy, who's been acting out and telling his mom how much he hates her and the sister, and they're biracial. And I kept saying to her, she's recently moved to an all-white environment. And I kept saying to her, there's something racial about this, and he feels threatened in this environment. And of course, you were like, oh, I don't think that's it. But then he got into a fight at school 2 days ago. And what he said in the midst of the all-white school, all-white town, white people are just really mean. And that opened the door for him to talk about how he experiences himself as a young boy, black male in this culture that has so clearly decided that black males are a threat that must be silenced. And he already knows that as 7, that he must be silenced. And that he doesn't feel support for his voice. Because I think we have to start there. Those of you who saw Fruitvale Station, who has a voice in our culture? I was a little disturbed even with the idea that we would start even with Zimmerman, because Trayvon Martin has no voice. His voice ended. So we will never know what he thought about himself as a black male, what he thought about his future as a black male, because he was completely silenced. And now we have to be careful that we don't become part of that silencing. I mean, one of the things I'm going to talk about at another point is what I call, for black people, suicidal genocide. That we are invited to participate in our own suicidal genocide. So that we become part of that, we become part of the execution.
You know, at the Kirwan Institute, we do a lot of thinking about how race affects perception. And when you use language like lynching, that feels very strong. And and a powerful accusation, I would suspect, to the audience here, and who might not think of this in the same way that they thought of lynchings in the past. But at the Kremlin Institute, we spend a lot of time thinking about unconscious bias and the way that the unconscious bias can play out in very similar ways that result in the loss of young black lives, as did conscious bias at a different point in the nation's history. So, what I've been saying is that when George Zimmerman reflexively thinks of Trayvon Martin right away as a danger and a criminal, that is a cognitive conclusion that is important for the country to examine.
Well, I was in a class here in Ohio State just the other day where a student said, look, aren't black men criminals? I mean, that's what we see. That's what we see on our TV screens. That's how black males act. So I think it's interesting to think about how that sense of black males as a threat. But I mean, this is one thing we're going to talk about too. Is, I mean, in Philadelphia, 75% of the homicides of black males are black on black homicide. 80% of the people arrested for homicide. So the real question is, who are black men threatening? Because it seems like the major people that black men threaten are each other. Not white people, not even black women, despite the reality of domestic violence and what have you. But the scariest thing seems to be how black men are encouraged to relate to one another, which is why I said, the sort of suicidal genocide. And I had written a paper, because I don't know why, but it was all about justice. But it was focusing on Dr. King's critique of the Black Power movement. And one of the things that he argued that we now see is so true, he argued that the worst thing in the world was for black males to embrace the idea of manhood tied up with violence. Because what he projected, and he was prescient, is that that would come back at us, that the violence, that the equation of manliness with violence would come back to us. And we see, I mean, remember that in 1967, Dr. King told the world that the United States was the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. And so, I mean, I hope we can bring up some of the ways that he acknowledged that black males had to deal with the question of violence both within and without. Because part of why so many white people, who go back to unconscious and conscious bias, feel violence against black males is that the perception of black males is that they are violent, that they are here to do harm. Okay, you can try to make this work.
1 second.
Okay, you gotta get away from it. I don't like it. Are you just turning it off? Or
Yeah, we can just turn it off and
Yeah. Okay. So did you hear that?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Okay. Well, I like the point that you're making that ties violence to conceptions of manliness, because it strikes me that the whole phenomenon of stand your ground laws is explained by the connection between violence, the use of force, and conceptions of masculinity or manliness. If we spend some time, as I have done, thinking about the origins of stand your ground laws, how they came about, in their first iteration, they were actually called shoot first laws. They originated in Florida. And part of the argument about extending this exemption from expectations of retreat is that expecting men to retreat was somehow unmanly. expecting men not to be acting as men. And so when we think about stand your ground laws, it suggests to me that it is evidence of the point that you're making there, how they have proliferated.
And also, if we think about the black woman that all of you heard about who shot into the air, well, obviously stand your ground didn't work for her. And then I think about one of my sisters living in one of the dangerous Michigan cities that, you know, her husband works late, she sees a man coming into the window at her house and she says, I have a gun. He says, so what? You're not going to shoot. Because frequently, well, she did shoot. He went right on back out that window. But I thought about that in terms of gender relations of stand your ground. The presumption is that to be woman is to not shoot, is to not protect yourself, is to not feel that you are worthy of protection, whereas just the opposite comes in when we talk about masculine gender. It is that you have to show that you are capable, you know, of dominance, of power. And, you know, one thing that often, you know, makes me so sad when people talk about Trayvon Martin is, again, that sense that we will not know what Trayvon Martin thought. That if he thought that he was just another kid on a bicycle, that he had no idea that he posed a threat, or that he would be treated like a threat, which raises such incredible questions about, I think, a generational divide between black people, because people of my generation, the 50s, those of us born in the 50s, we were constantly taught that we represented a threat, especially black males. But younger people growing up with the mass media, I mean, I was looking at all the commercials, the previews at the movie, and it's like everything was diverse. You know, black and white folks were just having a good time together. With sprinkles of Latin people and Asian people. And I was saying, isn't it interesting that the visuals we get in mass media are of multiculturalism, of racial diversity, but the reality of most of our lives, including mine, is segregation. That the majority of people around me are white. And so that this sense of, I think, threat has so much to do with what our real lives in this country are like. And I know I had an experience living in an all-white neighborhood for years that at one point a black man came to my door and I realized the first sensation I had was of threat. And it made me realize that I was not any different from anybody else who gets all the unconscious images and things that tell me to think of black males as a threat. And I was not conscious that I had any sense of that.
Yeah, and all of the evidence around unconscious bias research shows us that these are cognitive associations that impact not just white Americans, but black Americans too, who internalize them. There are hard neurological studies that have been conducted that show that the area of the brain called the amygdala, which has the fear impulses, fire off when people are presented with pictures of unfamiliar black male faces. The same kind of response that they would have when shown a picture of for example, snake or something that is truly potentially dangerous. So that's a significant burden for young black males in America. And I want to come back to what you were saying about what Trayvon Martin thought. After the verdict, I was interviewed by a local reporter here, a white male reporter who told me that he was surprised a little bit to hear so many African American parents talking about the kinds of conversations that they had to have with their children that seemed different to him than the kinds of conversations that white parents would have with their children, that reflected a different set of worries that black parents had that they knew required them to have a qualitatively different conversation with their children in order to safeguard them. And so I've reflected a lot about those conversations, and if, in fact, we do have to have those kinds of conversations with our black children. Trayvon Martin probably was quite well aware that in dealing with anybody who was like George Zimmerman, he would have to diffuse certain suspicions and fears of that individual. So talk to us a little bit about both that expectation of young males, particularly teenagers who could rightfully be not only insulted by the suspicion and the fear that they see every day in the eyes of others, but also the expectations that they would have to be responsible for diffusing those fears.
Well, I don't know how many of you saw the Howard University video where the different made by the law school, where the different black males come up to these, and they say, "Well, I look suspicious." But of course, I would be in my usual lady self and saying, "Well, yeah, they do look suspicious when they put on the hoodies." And so it's an interesting thing about the construction of, because we're back to maleness, and what is constructed for us as a threat in maleness, not just in black maleness, but in maleness, and how those things differ racially. Because I do think that a lot of black males of all ages go out their doors and they're on the defensive. They're knowing that I just can't go out here grinning and acting like the world is mine, because I've got to go out here paying attention in a state of on guard for what can happen to me. And the older the black males are, the more they know this. So I do think that one of the dangers, I'm not so sure, Sharon, I think black parents today are in a quandary. Because on one hand, as my friend said to me about her 7-year-old, she wants him to have a childhood. She doesn't want him to be burdened by race. But the fact is, the world is already looking at him through the lens of unconscious and unconscious bias, conscious and unconscious. So what does she do? She wants him to have the happy-go-lucky childhood that her daughter by a white man has. So she has the child by a white man and the child by a black man. And she can experientially see the difference in how they're related to. The little girl that constantly told, "You're so beautiful, she's so beautiful." Little kids at his school told him he was a monster. They didn't want him to touch him. So I think about the feminist theory on lesbianism as lesbian as monster. And we might really want to think about the construction of black maleness as monstrous. If we think about Dorothy Roberts' work on what's happening with black children, people taking black children away. If you read Medical Apartheid, which I talked about here last year, that the 27,000 children in New York City who are foster children for the people that lots of drugs are tried on, of course, are disproportionately black and brown. So that the whole idea of being safe, having a childhood, being protected, and let's go back to Sharon's area of expertise, which is being protected by walls. Because one of the things that many of us were very disappointed in was when Obama, in a sense, tried to soothe our rage by telling us that this was all, the Zimmerman verdict was all done appropriately by law. I just finished Dean Spade's book on trans violence and the law. And one of the things that he keeps repeating is, how do you deal with the fact that if your law is coming out of white supremacy and settler colonialism, that you can then talk about the law as a force of protection? So, can you talk some about that for us?
Yeah, we think about law today as being even-handed. We think about it that way because we know from our history that we have had laws at various points that haven't been even-handed, that have been literally, racist. And so today, when we have, for example, self-defense provisions, it doesn't say this is the self-defense provision that applies to white people, and this is the self-defense provision that applies to black people. But that doesn't necessarily mean that those laws, those provisions are applied in the same way. If race is operating on the human brain in differential ways. We may not think to look or examine the wisdom of new laws, like stand your ground laws, by contemplating in advance of those enactments whether or not they will operate differentially on persons because of their racial differences. So we can have technically a race-neutral or race-blind law that in fact operates in a not neutral or blind way at all. And that should be to a society that is concerned with justice and equality as much of a concern as we were concerned and moved away from laws that were specifically racist in character.
Well, the interesting thing to me is that the new laws, like the whole voting rights shifts, actually serve to reaffirm white supremacy. They affirm that there are groups of people who are more worthy of the law and more worthy of justice. And I've been writing so much about justice and how, and using the work of Dr. King and where do we go from here. And if you haven't read that, or you haven't read it lately, I urge you to go back to it, because he was so prescient in realizing that democracy would be under attack. I mean, that's the thing about unconscious bias and conscious bias is that white people don't see that what is happening to black males is a direct threat to everybody, because it's the undermining of democracy and the undermining of justice, and we're all affected by that. I mean, Dr. King actually was writing in Where Do We Go From Here about fascism and about the fact that white supremacists would rather see our country move away from democracy than have equality and equality of justice. So that I think that we see in all of these cases how we are becoming more estranged as a society. I mean, I'm sure all of you were in situations where people were taking sides on the Trayvon case, and where we had to listen to, and the same with Jonathan Ferrell, where you start to feel crazy. Come on, everybody, you feel crazy when people act like, well, he shouldn't have walked towards the police. He should have come out of this traumatic accident and been rational enough to remember, I'm living in an imperialist white supremacist patriarchy, and if I walk towards the police, I'm likely to be shot. So, I mean, this is the burden that's placed on the person of color. But think about white people. I mean, I think about white people. I think about the cop who killed Oscar Grant and who got 11 months. I mean, how did that change his life? But we never hear that part of the story. We never hear how the death of a black person, the unjust death of a black person, affects the killer, the white person who, I mean, one of the things, if you read Malcolm Gladwell, Blink, Outliers, The Tipping Point, one of the stories that he tells about Amadou Diallo that is very moving is that when, and this goes back to so much of the work at the Institute and Sharon's work, when the white cops realized that Amadou did not have a weapon to bring as much to the forefront in our discourses on race is the whole positionality of whiteness. Because we imbue whiteness with so much power that, I mean, I was pretty amazed when I read that story in Malcolm Gladwell's book, because to some extent, just as they dehumanized Amadou, I felt that in my mind, they were dehumanized. They were these brutal white predators, you know, who were like, we're in Africa and this is big game, you know? And we don't get to see their humanity. And that's one of the things that Malcolm tried to bring forth in telling the story, that the race is so insane in our nation, that people hold these fears and they don't know that they hold them. It's just like my friend, a really smart cultural critic, feminist, trying to tell me that her son, that the stuff wasn't about race. I was like, girlfriend, he's in this all-white world and he's the only little black thing. And you're telling me that he does not feel anything? That there's not an emotional relationship he has to that environment? After the little white kids told him he's a monster in the last school where he wasn't the only black kid. And I was saying to her, you know, my sister just came to live in this predominantly white world that I live in. And I was saying, you know, she lives across the street from me. That I looked up one morning and she was coming out her door. And I realized, I said, wow, I'm not the only adult black woman in sight. And I felt so happy about that. And I thought, if I can feel that at 61 years old, that somehow there's a burden of grace taken off me, if I can feel there's someone who understands me and my world that I'm coming from, how much more could a 7-year-old feel frightened, estranged? Everything he sees on TV is telling him that he's bad. And that's what the teachers are telling him, he's bad. And that's what the mama was telling him. She was spending all her time comforting the little biracial girl who couldn't believe that her brother was saying he hated her. You know? So I was like, what about him? So even on that level, how can we foreground a new way of thinking and seeing black masculinity? Is it even possible?
You know, I'm mindful that in the aftermath of the shooting, as it became more aware or known to the American public, that polls were showing that white Americans and black Americans were perceiving the shooting differently from the very beginning, and that after the verdict, white Americans and black Americans, obviously this is not true for every white American or black American, but the polls did show a gap between whether those groups thought, how they thought of it, whether they thought that it was necessary to arrest and charge Zimmerman to begin with, and whether they believed that the verdict was just or unjust as well. So can you speak to how in 2013 we can be a nation that has that kind of difference in viewpoint that seems to track race?
You know, one thing we have to all acknowledge is that our major propaganda machine for white supremacy is television, advertising, and the movies. And so what I think we can see, like I was reading Susan Douglas's book, Enlightened Sexism, Pop Culture, and she was talking about the fact that when black females are sexualized in videos, people don't see them as having sexual agency. They just see them through the usual lens of black women as hoe, prostitute, the stereotypes. So that, and then the studies have shown that black males, young black adolescent males who are looking at these videos do not actually see these women as desirable. That in fact, it pushes them more towards desiring white females that are perceived as not, you know, the bad woman or what have you. I believe, I do not watch television, and I really believe, and the white people I love in my life don't watch television, and other people, and I believe that there's that, but I mean, people are watching some really wacky stuff, and the fact is, television, media is not evil. Media has incredible potential to shift our lives. Like, my favorite film of last year was a film on environmentalism, A Fierce Green Fire. And one of the things they tried to do was to show the role of people of color, black people, other groups of people in the environmental movement in our nation, which we have traditionally thought of as a white movement. But it showed the hard work of black males in Alabama, many of them who first began to use the word environmental racism. So it was just to remind us that media does not have to reinforce imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy. But when it does so fiercely, as our media does, and people are watching it 24/7, it's just like my white friend that have a little angry white boy. They're like busy trying to figure out, why is he so angry? Why is he so violent? I was like, excuse me? Isn't he playing Angry Bird and every other little violent video game he can put his hands on? And like we're acting like there's some deep and profound mystery. His violence. And a lot of his violence is around, I want what I want when I want it. And I will not be denied. So if you think about that, because we were talking earlier today about the logic of wealth and power in our nation. Because we were saying, you know, why is it that white people don't look at white men in suits and fear them? I mean, if you think about poverty in our nation, what happened with the banks, what's going on, you know, there's a lot to be afraid of with a certain kind of white man in a suit. But that doesn't translate into fear-based, because I was looking at all the new movies that are coming out about white men, you know, stealing all the money and what have you, but they look glamorous. They look friendly. They're funny. You know, they look attractive. There's not a coding within that imagery of danger, of threat. And so how do we deal with that? I mean, how do we deal with the fact that the media is so strong in this?
You know, you've mentioned that President Obama made certain statements about the verdict, in particular after the verdict, when he made statements about the rule of law and respecting the functioning of the jury, because that is the system that we have. But I noticed some other things, particularly about the reaction to some of the things that President Obama said about the Trayvon Martin shooting. The first thing that he said before Zimmerman was even charged was that if he had a son, he would look like Trayvon Martin. And after the verdict, some days after we know, the president said that if he would himself have looked like Trayvon Martin some years earlier in his younger self, and that what the African American community was feeling as a result of the verdict was that something close to a wound, I think, an injury, a pain that was explained by African Americans' experiences in this country and informed by their experiences in this country. Now, the reaction to President Obama's speaking about the lived experiences, particularly of African American men, was in some conservative circles quite accusatory.
But Sharon, do you really think they heard him? Did they believe him? Did they really believe him when he said, if I had a son? Or did they discount that?
I think that
I just get it.
in keeping I'm going to say something maybe different, and that is that it strikes me that as a part of colorblind ideology, which I think is a really potent movement in the country today, this idea that we should not talk about race, the decision of the President of the United States to talk directly about race was an affront to those who think that by doing so, black people are actually interjecting race into something that wasn't racial to begin with.
But that's where I would disagree with you. I don't see that he was talking directly about race. I think that, I mean, one of the things I was thinking about in terms of this conversation earlier was, how do we get people to move away from the personal? The idea that, you know, we should care, you know, about somebody because his mother would be sad if he's dead, or, you know, like this idea that, so we have on one hand the loss of a sense of an ethics of justice, but then we have this emphasis on the personal. So when Obama says that could be me, you know, it's this whole, to me, deflection away from white supremacy, away from systemic racialized domination, so that it becomes about personal, personal safety, personal regard, and not, let's really talk about white supremacy. I mean, why is it we can't have a national discourse about the reality of white supremacy? Because since that's a lot of the work I do, Sharon, what I get from people is, what are you talking about? We don't have white supremacy in this country. I mean, that's South Africa, or that's some other place. And it seems to me that that's been so at the heart of us being able to educate for critical consciousness, where people can acknowledge conscious and unconscious biases, is that there's the refusal to hear that white supremacy exists as a system of thinking with habits and practices. So that the interesting thing is that when Obama says that could have been me, that could have been, or the suggestion, my son, it becomes racialized in a certain way. But in general, the whole movement in our culture is away from racialization. And so we have Obama caught in his own cognitive dissonance. He can say that personally, but then the whole thing about the law is the application that, come on, unruly black people. This is what the law is our country, our nation. We have to respect it, even if we think that it is a judgment that is not a correct judgment. We have to support the law. And I think that's been the tension with him as a black male in power in the presidency. Who will he serve? And so it has really raised that whole question of bias where he's concerned, because so many white people, initially, he had to basically prove that he would not be supportive of black people in any way that could be construed as bias.
Yeah, and I think we have a lot of examples of that the president, as an African-American male president, has had to stay away from a lot of conversations about race just because of his race and gender. And that, I think...
He had to stay away from them. I'm sorry for interrupting, but is he choosing to stay away from them?
All right, now fair enough. But we have some examples. Everybody can remember the arrest of Skip Gates, Professor Gates, on his porch, when the president referred to that arrest as a stupid arrest. The outrage that he was met over that statement alone caused the infamous beer summit to happen at the White House. And if you look carefully at the response by a number of journalists to the president saying after the Zimmerman verdict that he had the experience in his life of entering elevators and having people clutch their bags, white women clutch their bags, or being followed around in department stores in a way, or walking past cars where the locks were being clicked when he was a younger black man, not recognizable to the country as he is today. I think that the president was offering to the country that there is something that is valuable about the lived experience experiences of African American men that is relevant to the conversation about the Zimmerman verdict. And so, but those statements were inflammatory to some who think that what that did was cause divisiveness on the grounds of race.
Don't you think, I mean, I just don't feel like we can believe everything that people say. You know, like I believe that people can say that, but the real thing is, let's make sure that we silence, as we talked about Trayvon being silenced, let's talk about all the ways President Obama has been silenced. Not around race, because one of the things that I think is we have to make a distinction between racism and white supremacy. Because people of color in this room, you know that we are involved and colluding with white supremacy all the time. So that when I think of white supremacy, I'm never thinking of like white people, you know, white people are the problem. I'm thinking that white supremacy is the problem and how to teach all of us what our role is in that. You know, and that's why it's really sad in a way that we don't have an opportunity to ask a Trayvon Martin, how did he see Zimmerman? I mean, think about how much focus there has been on how Zimmerman perceived him. So that once again, I mean, I think that one of the most brilliant bell hooks essays ever written is the one that's Whiteness in the Black Imagination, where I write about our fear of white people that is basically not acknowledged. You know, that many of us experience white people as a threat. But where do we have the space to articulate that? Where do we, and that's very different from saying, I felt like when I was followed around in the store. But it's that sense of harm can be done to me. And in fact, okay, you know how Bell likes to get personal. So I'm dating this white man, Detroit policeman. We met at Bell Hooks reading. And he wants me to come to his house in Detroit. And I said, I can't come to your house, I don't know you. Because you are a man with a gun. And more importantly, you are a white male with a gun, and you are a white policeman with a gun. Suppose I come to your house, and we get into a fight, and you shoot me. And what people say is, well, she's really a whore. And she was really, you know, soliciting at the airport. And, I mean, he thought that I was insane. Like, how could you project all of that? But I thought, how can I not, as a female, as who understands rape and domestic violence, you know, as a militant feminist thinker, how could I not project all of that into what could happen? Because I don't feel safe, you know, and I don't feel, and I mean, for example, just on the level that he felt, well, why would you think I could hurt you? And I was like, let's look at the history of white men in this society. But not only that, how I feel you could hurt me with impunity. I do not feel that there's any structure of law that would protect. So, because I'm sorry that we don't have enough time to have question and answers, but I want to throw this out because I want us to be vigilant about it as we think about Jonathan Ferrell, Oscar Grant, Trayvon Martin. I think that we have to be careful that this sort of discourse of black masculinity isn't appropriated by a larger discourse of the reaffirmation of patriarchy. So that once again we hold up the black male body or the male body, whether it's Zimmerman's body or Trayvon Martin's body, as these are bodies that are worthy of life, of discussion, of support, and that within this frame, because we were going to talk about this, there is a certain kind of mother blaming.
Talk to us about that.
That goes on. Well, I think about Fruitvale, that the mother ends up saying that she is to blame for what happened because she encouraged him to take the subway rather than to drive. So that once again we have that whole sort of and patriarchy in our society, because, okay, y'all know the Elvis is not going to talk about race without talking about patriarchy, because you cannot separate the two things. Because if we can't see how patriarchy has a chokehold on black men, the black men who think that they have to have a gun. Now, I know plenty of black women who think they have to have guns. I'm the only woman in my family that doesn't think they have to have a gun. But they're not thinking that they have to shoot somebody for their subjectivity. They don't have to pull out those guns at the drop of a hat because somebody said something they don't like. Whereas we live in that culture where, especially working class and poor men of all races, like, feel that they have to pull those guns out. Or if you live in a state like mine where you can drive with your rifle in Kentucky, and I went out with some redneck white man, you can see how desperate I have to look. So he has a gun, and I say to him, I'm really not comfortable around guns. Could we put that in terms? Bail, I've been carrying this gun with me since I was 14 years old. And I said, yeah, but somebody might look over into this pickup truck and not like us being together. And we could, again, think about my sense of the racialized world is a world of danger and a threat where I am not safe. But his whole sense is that he can have that gun, he can use it, he will be safe, he will be respected. Let's remember as we close that the word respect comes from the Latin, meaning to look at. And that part of what has hurt us as black people, that hurt Trayvon Martin, is we're not really looked at. I mean, if we analyze what Zimmerman thought he saw when he looked at Trayvon Martin, he didn't see him at all. He didn't see a child. He didn't see a boy on a bicycle. He saw whatever projections of black masculinity, not just as threat, but as something that I have to kill, which is so deep. Anyhow, I want to take a minute to thank the Kirwan Institute, to thank Shannon and Women's Studies, to thank Sharon, who is new to the Institute still, first, second year as director, for having this conversation, and most of all, to thank all of you for coming out on a Friday. We have so much more we could have said, but what we really want to charge all of you with is to be vigilant in your own lives, in looking at how you construct self and identity, how you enact domination, how you live within the imperialist criteria.